Hello everyone. Today's video we're going to be doing is, could Cenozoic Asian animals survive on Sky Island 2017? Now, we're not going to be doing the current one. We'll start with the beginning of Sky Island before, after the extinction of the dinosaurs, that is. We'll start with Cenozoic animals from China, India, Malaysia, and there are other animals that I might have excluded, but I'll do a part 3 sooner. So let's get started. Enhydriodon, a giant otter, but not the ones in Africa. Let's start with the two species, E. falconeri and E. silvarensis, as the two of them are both specialized for commonly eating shellfish. This claim was made by from Endogelus of a diet of Enhydria. It is suggested that the thick enamel and the posterior dentition of the Indian Enhydriodon species make them more molluscivorous rather than carnivorous. They would live in less draining in the food system, like rivers or even lakes. Manus paleojavanica, or also known as Asian giant pangolin, is a species of pangolin found in Southeast Asia. For their diet, like its modern relative, they are insectivorous. And for their habitat and environment, forests, grasslands, and areas with termites and ant populations. It specializes in foraging, like beetles, cockroaches. It feeds on the eggs of larvae and adults of its prey, but eggs are preferred choice. Alubellepauda baconi, a very large panda. For their diet, they would eat bamboo. And for their habitat, open forests environment. Alupoda macrota. For their habitat, they would live in moist lowland tropical furthest forests habitat. And for their diet, bamboo. Alligator monensis. For their habitat, they would live in lowlands and floodplains with variety of water bodies, including marshes, ponds, and streams. And for their diet, hard-shelled prey like snails. in addition to other animals as well. Asian ostrich. For their diet, they are omnivorous, consisting primarily on plants, but also including lizards, snakes, rodents, and insects. And for their habitat and environment, they would live in open grassy areas and semi-arid regions. Bos acutifrons. For their diet, grazer, and for their habitat and environment, I could not find any information what environment they would live in. So moving on. Bobarus muscistopheles, also known as the short-horned water buffalo. They would live in floodplains, rivers, and for their diet, herbivore. Bubarus paleocarabao, well, also known as its unofficial name, the giant long-horned water buffalo. For their habitat, they will live in open prairies with bush, meadow, and swamp environments. And for their diet, a grazer and browser. Bubarus wonsojonsky. For their habitat and environment, they will live in relatively warm and moist environment, mixture of grassland, forests, and swamps. And for their diet, herbivore. Camelus noblachi. For their habitat, they will live primarily on steppe and to lesser degree forest steppe rather than the desert environments. And for their diet, browser. Cave hyena. And for their diet, they will prey on large ungulates. And like wild horses, bovids, deer, wild boar. And for their habitat and environment, well, they would live in plains and grasslands with evidence of using caves as dens. Dinofelis. For their environment and habitat, forests, woodlands, and possibly wetlands. And for their diet, large grazing mammals, antelope, young elephants, rhinos, and potentially hunted early hominins. So it looks like the iwi will have to watch their backs of this human killer. The dire wolf. And I know what you're thinking. Did dire wolves ever live in Asia? Here's the answer. Yes, they did. Not just North America, and possibly in South America. For their environment, the darter wolf would live in open lowlands, forested mountain areas, plains, grasslands. And for their diet, they would prey on extinct camels, bison, horse, sloths, mammoths, mastodon. But I could not find what prey they would eat in Asia. Likely horses, camels, deer, and even Asian extinct bovids. Dubious Xiaotang. For their environment, they will live in forests. And for their diet, they would feed on fruits and leaves similar to the four-horned antelopes today. Elasmotherium pi, the Asian species, for its diet. These herbivores are likely specialized in grazing on tough, dry grasses and other low-lying vegetation, as evident by its specialized teeth and head. And for their habitat, they would live in grasslands. Elephas hysodracus. For their diet, they are mixed feeders, both browsing and grazing. And for their habitat, I could not find any information about it, so moving on. Elephas hysotratricus, also known as the Bora elephant, with a Blora. And for their diet, C4 grazing, and habitat. I could not find information about it. I'd like to take a guess. Forest, grasslands, plains. Equus pneumaticus. For their habitat, they would live in open grassland habitats. And for their diet, C4 grasses. And Equus sylvanensis, they would live in grasslands and diet C4 grasses. Gigantopithecus, for their diet, they would feed on fruits, leaves, roots, and tubers. These may provide additional nutrients and hydration. And bamboo. And for their environment and habitat, they would live in dense subtropical evergreen broadleaf forests. Grasslands. Giraffa sylvanensis, for their habitat and environment and diet. I could not find information about them, so Moving on. Hesperotherium, one of the last algathers. For their habitat, they will live in subtropical to tropical forests. And for their diet, they would feed it on foliage, possibly bark, and fruits. Hexaprotodon. For their environment, they will likely live in streams, submerged aquatic plants, and shrub/trees along riverbanks. And for their diet, grazing, similar to modern hippos. Homotherium. For their habitat, they will live in plains. They were adapted to open habitats like the plains and grasslands and forests. While they prefer open habitats, they likely also foraged in woodlands. And for their diet, they would likely prey on juvenile mammoths, bovids, and horses. Hystrix vervosa, a species of prehistoric porcupine. For their habitat, they will live in vegetated riverbanks within a mosaic of open and forested terrain under warm and humid conditions. And for their diet, vegetation like fruits, roots, bulbs, and bark, with a possibility of supplementing with bones for calcium. And yes, there are species of porcupine that eat bones for calcium. Indian aurochs. For their habitat, they will live in grasslands, floodplains, and lightly forested woodlands in temperate climates. And for their diet, grazers, consuming grasses, twigs, and acorns. Leptotylos falconeri. For their diet, they will have if they were switching between a lifestyle of being a scavenger on carrion, unlike other storks. They would prey on fish and invertebrates. And for their habitat, they would live in areas with grasslands and wetlands. And Leptotylos titan. For their diet, feeding on carrion and occasionally supplementing their diet with small live prey like fish and invertebrates. And habitat, grasslands and wetlands. And for their habitat, they will live in forests, woodlands, and wetlands. Oh, I forgot. Mammut borsoni. And for their diet, they are primarily browsers, feeding on leaves and twigs of woody plants. Megalocoles. For their habitat, they would live in ancient river systems with lush floodplains. And for their diet, they are herbivorous, primarily feeding on grasses, fruits, and cactus pads. Megatarian. For their diet, they would prey on hominids, like early hominids, as well as baboons, meaning they would likely hunt the iwi on that island. This is the true killer of hominids. Mellivora silvaensis. There is not much information about it, of its habitat and diet, and it is related to the living honey badger. Nesotoretherium, another Clycotherium. For their habitat, I could not find information where they live. And for their diet, they would feed on leaves and fruits of trees and shrubs. Panthera tigris soloensis, or the Nyandong tiger. For their prey, they would feed on wild pigs, deer, and possibly even species of elephants like the stegodon, the smaller species, and even rhinoceros calves. And for their habitat, they would likely live in forested areas, grasslands, Pachycrocuta, or the short-faced hyena. For their habitat, they would live in plains and grasslands, woodlands and forest edges, caves. Not exclusively confined to caves, some evidence suggests that Pachycrocuta may have used caves for their dens, similar to modern spotted hyenas. And for their diet, they would feed on large mammals like protoscidians, horses, rhinoceros, deer, and bovids, either preying or scavenging from other predators' carcass. They are kleptoparasitic scavengers of kills from other predators. Pachystruthio. For their habitat, they will live in arid grasslands. And for their diet, they primarily feed on plant matter like leafy greens, flowering plants, roots, grasses, and succulents, with occasional consumption of small animals. Paleoloxodon waihoensis. For their environment and habitat, they would live in forests, woodlands, and possibly grasslands similar to other straight-tusked elephants. And for their diet, they would feed on mixed diet of consuming both grasses and browses like leaves and twigs. And here we have the largest of the straight-tailed elephants, Paleoxodon nematicus. For their habitat, they primarily inhabited open grassland habitats. And for their diet, they likely had a grazing, predominant mixed feeding diet, meaning they primarily feed on grasses and also consume some browse. Bos paleocyclodicus. I could not find information about it, what its habitat and diet is. Moving on.
Bosilophus nematicus.
Bosilophus nematicus. Bosilophus nematicus. For their habitat, they will live in open and dry habitats, likely dominated by open grasslands. And for their diet, they are grazer and browser, meaning it consumed fibrous plant matter like grasses and leaves. Cave bears. They inhabit low mountainous areas. While they didn't live in caves, they used them for hibernation during the long, harsh Ice Age winters. And for their diet, there is some research that they are primarily herbivorous. Other studies indicate they are omnivorous, with some evidence even suggesting they were carnivorous at times. Euclidosauros. For their habitat, they would live in grasslands and open forests, mixed of open forest and steppe environments, arid climates as well. And for their diet, they would eat plastericty diet, Gavilis bengawanicus. For their habitat, rivers, lakes, streams, and even wetlands. And for their diet, like their relatives, they would primarily consist of fish with juveniles also consuming insects, crustaceans, and frogs. Hemibos, diet, grasses, and habitat, plains, grasslands. Mesocyon, They would have hunted prey of 1 kilogram to 10 kilogram, preferably 5 kilogram in size. It is unknown if they hunted in packs or if carrion left over by the tiger influenced its feeding habits, likely prey including rats and birds. And their habitat, they would live in grasslands, semi-arid areas. Megacion for their diet. They have thought to have been hypercarnivores that prey on large-sized prey, such as deer. For their habitat, they would have likely lived in grasslands, forested areas, plains. And the giant cheetah. For their environment and habitat, they would have inhabited open forest and savanna-like habitats. Like modern cheetahs, they may also forage in woodlands or thickets to avoid larger predators. And for their diet, they would prey on a variety of large ungulates like deer, horses, elk, sandbar. That's it for this video, so stay tuned for part 3. Like and subscribe, and see you later, guys.